All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating, tightly argued, and honestly deeply counterintuitive philosophical texts ever written. We are looking at Friedrich Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, specifically his second essay. And it asks a massive question. Where does human morality actually come from? We generally tend to think of morality, and specifically that nagging feeling of guilt, as something spiritual, right? Like it just descended from the heavens fully formed. But as we're going to see today, Nietzsche completely flips this assumption on its head. He's taking us on a wild journey to prove that our highest, most sacred moral feelings actually have very gritty, material, and sometimes downright painful origins. To really get into Nietzsche's headspace here, I want you to think back to a highly relatable scenario. Think about a time when you were punished as a kid, maybe by your parents, a teacher, whoever. And I want you to be totally honest with yourself for a second. Did that punishment actually make you feel genuinely, deeply guilty? Or did it just make you feel resentful, cautious, and highly determined not to get caught the next time? Keep your answer to that in mind, because we're going to use it to challenge a deeply held assumption and set the stage for a massive paradigm shift in how we view morality and justice. Moving into our first main concept, the language of debt. Now, what's literally fascinating here is how Nietzsche uses linguistics to prove his point. He doesn't just sit around theorizing, he actually looks at the very words we use to communicate moral concepts to show that morality didn't just fall out of the sky. To see how this works, we just have to look at language. In English, we split the concepts of guilt and debt into completely different roots. We treat guilt as this heavy moral or spiritual issue, and debt as a strictly economic one. Because of that split, his argument can actually feel a little forced when it's translated into English. But in German, a single word covers both concepts: Schuld. Anyone who hears the word Schuld hears both guilt and debt at the exact same time. For Nietzsche, this isn't just some clever pun. It's actual historical evidence. The fact that one word covers both concepts reveals a genuine historical connection. He's arguing that moral guilt actually evolved directly from the highly physical, material practice of lending, borrowing, owing, and repaying. Basically, the earliest human sense of obligation was economic, not spiritual. But you really don't have to speak German to see the echoes of this today. Just think about the phrases we use all the time. We talk about paying for our sins. We talk about redeeming ourselves. We discuss the wages of sin. It's wild, but without even knowing it, when we speak about spiritual guilt today, we are still completely speaking the ancient language of commerce and the debtor-creditor relationship. Nietzsche traces this connection through centuries of legal and religious history, essentially proving that our loftiest spiritual ideals were born straight out of the marketplace. Which brings us to the next section, why punishment fails. This whole connection between debt and guilt builds into this absolutely devastating critique of our entire justice system and how we manage behavior. Think about it. It's a super common assumption, shared by parents, judges, and moral philosophers alike, that the experience of being punished actually produces a sense of guilt and contrition. We punish people and fully expect them to reflect on their actions, see the error of their ways, and undergo this magical moral transformation. But Nietzsche, he argues the exact opposite. He points out that, historically speaking, the people who were most exposed to punishment, like criminals, prisoners, and slaves, are actually the exact ones least likely to develop a guilty conscience. Punishment doesn't create remorse, no way. What it actually creates is caution, cunning, resentment, and hardness. Why? Well, because punishment is fundamentally an external imposition. It acts purely on the body. A prisoner who gets beaten simply learns to avoid getting caught next time. That external force definitely doesn't teach the prisoner to feel that they inherently deserve the beating. So here's the really crucial takeaway. External punishment can only reinforce fear. If Nietzsche is right about this, then our entire criminal justice system rests on a huge fundamental confusion. We literally cannot beat, jail, or fine someone into a genuine moral transformation. True guilt requires something entirely different. It requires the internalization of aggressive instincts. It has to come from within, not from the outside. So yeah, punishment might reinforce guilt if it's already there, but it absolutely cannot create it from scratch. Let's explore that idea of coming from within in this next section, disease or pregnancy. This right here brings us to the very core of human interiority, because if punishment doesn't create guilt, what actually does? Well, this leads us to one of Nietzsche's most profound and honestly kind of heavy concepts, bad conscience. We really need to define this clearly, because for Nietzsche, this marks the exact agonizing moment humans developed a soul.
Bad conscience is that internal sense of deserving punishment. But since it doesn't come from external authorities, where on earth does it come from? Nietzsche argues that humans naturally have these wild, aggressive instincts. But when early humans were forced into the tight confines of society and civilization, those outward aggressive instincts were suddenly blocked. You couldn't just safely express them anymore without getting into trouble. So what happens to an instinct that can't let itself out? It turns inward. It attacks the self. And that turning inward of our aggressive instincts, that is the exact birth of bad conscience.
Nietzsche actually calls bad conscience a disease. He says it's painful, disorienting, and totally debilitating. It's a condition where humanity is literally tearing itself apart from the inside. But then, and this is classic Nietzsche, he completely flips the script. He says it's a disease as pregnancy is a disease. Think about that for a second. While a normal illness just destroys, a pregnancy creates something genuinely new. Bad conscience is the painful, sickening condition required to actually give birth to human depth. And that perfectly sets up our final major concept, the price of a soul. We're going to slow down here for just a second, because we really need to appreciate the awe-inspiring trade-off humanity made. This is honestly where Nietzsche's thought is that it's most complex and, frankly, most easily misunderstood. Without this terrible inner cruelty, what would we even be? Nietzsche suggests we'd basically just be magnificent animals, strong, spontaneous, acting entirely without guilt, kind of like the blonde beast or noble predator he describes earlier in his work. But while that noble predator is super strong, it completely lacks depth. Because we internalized our instincts, because we suffered the sickness of bad conscience, we gained some pretty extraordinary gifts. We gained the entire inner world of human experience. We gained the capacity for self-reflection, the ability to set goals for our own self-transformation, and the power to imagine being something completely other than what we currently are. So bad conscience, for all its agonizing cruelty, is quite literally the womb of human culture, art, philosophy, and religion. It's the extremely heavy price we paid for having souls.
So given all that, the ultimate question isn't how do we get rid of bad conscience, because simply put, we can't. The real question is, what do we do with it? Nietzsche points out that historically, the priestly route has been to moralize this internal pain, to interpret our bad conscience as evidence of our innate sinfulness and our absolute unworthiness before God. But Nietzsche completely challenges us to take a different path. He wants us to redirect bad conscience. He wants us to stop using it for endless self-punishment and instead harness that incredible inner depth towards self-creation and affirmation. He's basically daring us to use the very tools of our inner suffering to sculpt ourselves into something far greater.
I'm going to leave you with this incredibly provocative thought straight from the source material to ponder today. When you look at your own internal struggles, your own guilt, your own self-criticism, is there a gentler path to self-awareness? Or is Nietzsche right? Is this inner cruelty, this turning of your own instincts against yourself, the absolute unavoidable price for your depth and humanity? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the origins of the things you hold most sacred.